The notice was nailed to the post outside the assayer's office, the paper already curling in the dry Nevada heat. Lin Yao read the words twice, her stomach tightening with each one. An ordinance concerning unlicensed canines. A tax of $5 per animal, to be paid within the week. Any dog without a metal tag by Saturday next would be impounded and, if unclaimed after 24 hours, dispatched. The word dispatched was written in a clerk's neat, merciless hand. It was a clean word for a dirty business. Beside her, a golden-coated dog with a broad head and gentle brown eyes sat patiently, his tail thumping a soft rhythm against the dusty boardwalk. His name was Bao, and he was all she had left of her husband. $5 might as well have been 500. Lin lived on the coin she earned washing shirts for miners at the edge of town, a life eked out in steam and lye soap. Her husband, Wei, had worked on the railroad until a blasting accident left her a widow at 24, with only his final month's wages and the dog he'd raised from a pup. She placed a hand on Bao's head, the coarse silk of his fur a familiar comfort. He leaned into her touch, oblivious. The ordinance was the work of Mr. Finch, the town's self-important clerk, who believed order was best imposed through fees and fines. He disliked the camp dogs that roamed the settlement's edges, and this was his way of tidying his world. But for Lin, it was not a matter of tidiness. It was a final, quiet amputation. For 3 days, she tried. She took on extra laundry until her knuckles were raw and bleeding, the skin split from the harsh soap. She sold the last of Wei's possessions she'd clung to, his good boots and a small, carved pipe. It earned her $1.75. Not nearly enough. She walked to the mercantile, her heart a cold stone in her chest, and asked Mr. Henderson if he had any work, any at all. He looked at her, then at the other customers in the store, and shook his head. Sorry, Mrs. Yao. Nothing right now. His apology was quiet, but his refusal was loud enough for everyone to hear. On Friday afternoon, with the sun beating down on the parched earth, she counted her savings again. $2.12. She had failed. There was no one to borrow from, no one to ask for help. In this town, she was a ghost, visible only when someone needed their clothes scrubbed clean. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the floor of her small shack, Bao's heavy head in her lap, and listened to the sounds of the desert. She remembered Wei bringing him home, a clumsy ball of yellow fur, his paws too big for his body. He will guard you, Wei had said, his voice full of a confidence she no longer possessed. He is Bao. Our treasure. The next morning, she washed Bao until his coat shone like spun gold. She brushed him with a stiff bristled brush she couldn't afford but had bought for him months ago. He endured it all with a saint's patience, licking her hand when she paused. Then, she tied a piece of clean twine around his neck for a leash and walked him into the center of town. The walk to the constable's office felt like a mile for every step. The town was awake now, merchants sweeping their stoops, freight wagons rumbling down the main street. People saw her. They saw the beautiful, clean dog at her side, and they saw the set of her face. They knew where she was going. Some looked away. No one stepped forward. The constable's office was little more than a desk and 2 cells, smelling of stale tobacco and regret. Mr. Finch was there, standing beside Constable Miller, a ledger open before him. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Mrs. Yao, he said, his voice smooth and official. Hear about the ordinance, I presume. Lin couldn't find her voice. She simply nodded, her hand tightening on the twine. Bao, sensing her distress, pressed against her leg. A fine animal, Finch continued, not unkindly, but with the detached air of a man completing a transaction. A shame you cannot afford the tax. Constable Miller will take him. Constable Miller, a burly man with a weary face, stepped forward. He avoided her eyes. Come on, boy, he said softly, reaching for the twine. Lin flinched, pulling the leash back. Please, she whispered, the word tearing from her throat. Isn't there another way? The law is the law, Finch said, his tone hardening. Rules are what separate us from savagery. It was then that a voice spoke from the doorway, a voice she had heard before but never paid much mind. It was quiet and had a rough, unused quality to it. "I will pay the tax." All three of them turned. Leaning against the doorframe was Caleb Hayes. He was a rancher who lived a few miles out of town, a man who kept to himself. He came in for supplies, loaded his wagon, and left without speaking more than a dozen words to anyone. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and dark hair that was always a little too long. His eyes, she noticed for the first time, were a startlingly clear blue. He was looking not at her, but at the dog. Finch straightened up, puffing out his chest slightly. "Mr. Hayes, this is a private matter." "Doesn't sound private," Caleb said, his gaze shifting to the constable. "The ordinance allows for any citizen to pay the tax on behalf of the owner, does it not?" Finch opened his mouth, then closed it. He consulted his ledger. "Well, yes, technically. But..." Caleb didn't wait for the but. He walked to the desk, pulled a worn leather pouch from his pocket, and counted out $5 silver. The coins landed on the wood with a series of heavy, final clicks. "There. His licensed." He looked at Finch. "Give the woman her tag." Finch, flustered and irritated at being overruled, grudgingly found a small metal tag and pushed it across the desk toward Lynn. She stared at it, then at Caleb Hayes. He was already turning to leave, as if the matter were concluded. "Wait," Lynn called out, her voice stronger now. He paused, his back still mostly to her. "Why?" He turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. "I don't like to see a good dog put down." He said it simply, as a statement of fact, like saying the sky was blue or the ground was dry. But his solution was only temporary. Lynn knew it. She couldn't afford to feed Bao properly, not on what she made. The tax was one crisis, but survival was another, constant one. She could not accept his charity, however kindly meant. It would solve nothing. "I cannot take your money, sir," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I have no way to repay you." Caleb Hayes turned fully then, and he looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the defiant pride in her posture, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the way her hand rested protectively on her dog's neck. He was silent for a long moment, the gears turning behind his quiet gaze. "I need a housekeeper," he said, the words coming out slowly, as if he were assembling them from a language he rarely used. "My place. It's gotten away from me. Cooking, cleaning. I'll pay you a fair wage. Room and board included. For both of you." He nodded toward Bao. "There's plenty of space for a dog." The offer hung in the dusty air of the office. Constable Miller looked surprised. Mr. Finch looked scandalized. To Lynn, it sounded like a lifeline thrown into a raging river. A job. A home. A way to keep her dog. But it also meant leaving the only place she knew, miserable as it was, and entrusting herself to a complete stranger. A silent, solitary man who lived miles from anywhere. She looked from Caleb's steady, unreadable face to Bao, who nudged her hand with his wet nose. The choice was not a choice at all. It was the only door that had opened. "I accept," she said. The journey to Caleb's ranch was made in near silence. Lynn sat on the wagon bench, a small cloth bundle containing her few possessions at her feet. Bao lay contentedly in the wagon bed, his nose twitching at the new smells of sagebrush and pine. Caleb handled the team of horses with an easy, competent air, his large, calloused hands gentle on the reins. He did not seem to feel the need to fill the quiet, and for that, Lynn was grateful. It gave her time to watch the familiar, dusty streets of the town give way to open, rolling country. The land grew rougher, the hills steeper. After an hour, he turned the wagon onto a bare track that wound its way up into a shallow canyon. The ranch, when it came into view, was nestled in a small, defensible valley, a thread of a creek running through it. The house was a simple clapboard structure, solid but weathered, its paint long since scoured away by sun and wind. A large barn stood nearby, in better repair than the house, and several corrals held a handful of horses. It was stark and isolated, a place built for solitude, not comfort. Caleb pulled the team to a halt and set the brake. "This is it," he said. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand briefly touching hers. His skin was rough, but his grip was careful. Inside, the house was just as he'd said. A layer of dust coated every surface. Dishes were piled by a dry sink. It was the home of a man who had forgotten how to live in a house, or perhaps had never learned. "Your room is this way," he said, leading her to a small, spare room at the back. It contained a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a single, small window looking out over the creek. "It's not much." "It is enough," Lynn said, and she meant it. It was a room. It was a roof. It was safety. The first few weeks passed in a quiet routine. Lynn scrubbed the house from top to bottom. She aired out dusty linens, beat rugs, and made the small space feel like a home again. She cooked for Caleb, simple, hearty meals that he ate with a quiet appreciation that was more eloquent than words. He would come in from his work with the horses, wash his hands and face at the pump outside, and sit at the table. He never said much, but he always left his plate clean. He was a man of immense physical competence. He could calm a spooked horse with a low murmur and a steady hand. He could mend a broken fence with a few deft movements, his work solid and true. But words seemed to fail him. Their conversations were brief, functional exchanges about supplies or meals. Yet, she began to see things in the silence. She saw the way he always made sure the wood box was full for her, the way he left a bucket of fresh water by the door each morning. He watched out for her, in his own quiet way. Bao thrived. He spent his days exploring the valley, chasing jackrabbits, and swimming in the creek, always returning to the porch in the evenings to lay his head on Lynn's feet. He seemed to understand that this was their home now. The isolation that had at first seemed daunting became a kind of peace. Here, she was not the poor Chinese widow. She was Lynn, the woman who ran the house. And he was Caleb, the man who ran the ranch. Their roles were clear. But beneath that clarity, something else was stirring. A fragile, tentative respect. The first crack in their careful solitude came not from within, but from the sky. One afternoon in late summer, the air grew thick and heavy, the light turning a strange, bruised yellow. Dark clouds boiled up over the western ridge. Caleb came in from the barn, his face grim. "Storm's coming," he said. "A bad one. Bring the laundry in. I'll check on the horses." The rain started as a few fat, sporadic drops, then became a torrent. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud the little house seemed to shake. Lynn had just pulled the last of the dry sheets from the line when a bolt of lightning struck a tall pine on the ridge above them. There was a sound like the world tearing in half, and the tree exploded in a shower of sparks. Within moments, a line of orange fire was racing along the dry ridge, fanned by the rising wind. "Get the buckets!" Caleb yelled, running from the barn. "To the creek!" There was no time for fear. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm, sloshing buckets of water from the creek and throwing them at the encroaching flames that were now licking at the dry grass of their valley. The smoke was thick and choking, stinging their eyes. Cinders rained down around them. Bao barked frantically from the safety of the porch. A gust of wind sent a sheet of flame leaping toward the barn. "The horses!" Caleb shouted, grabbing an axe. He ran toward the barn, intending to break down a section of the corral to let the terrified animals run free. As he swung the axe against a post, a burning branch, heavy as a man's arm, crashed down from a nearby tree. It struck him across the shoulder and back, sending him sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain. Lynn screamed his name. For a moment, she was frozen, the bucket slipping from her hands. But then the sight of him, struggling to rise, broke through her panic. She ran to him, heedless of the flames. She helped him to his feet, his arm hanging limp at his side, his face pale with shock and pain. "I'm all right," he gasped, but he could barely stand. "No, you are not," she said, her voice sharp with a command she didn't know she possessed. "Get to the house. Now." Somehow, she wrestled him back to the cabin, the fire roaring behind them. Just as they stumbled through the door, the heavens opened completely. The rain, which had been a downpour, became a deluge. It hammered on the roof and hissed against the fire, and through the smoke-grimed window, Lynn saw the flames begin to falter, beaten back by the sheer force of the water. The immediate danger was past, but Caleb was hurt. His shirt was singed, and a nasty burn was already beginning to blister on his shoulder. His arm was twisted at an unnatural angle. Lynn tore his shirt away, her movements quick and efficient. She washed the wound with clean water and whiskey from a bottle he kept for medicinal purposes, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. The arm, she was sure, was broken. She found 2 flat pieces of wood from the kindling box and tore strips from a clean bedsheet. "This will hurt," she said, her voice soft but steady. He looked at her, his blue eyes clouded with pain but clear with trust. He nodded. She set the bone as best she could, her jaw tight with concentration, trying to remember what she'd seen the railroad doctors do. He cried out once, a sharp, ragged sound, and then fell silent, his breathing harsh in the quiet room. She bound the splint tightly, then helped him to his bed. She covered him with a blanket and sat in a chair beside him, watching him as the storm raged outside and the last of the fire died. In the flickering lamplight, he looked younger, more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. The quiet, capable rancher was gone, and in his place was just a man, hurt and in her care. She did not yet know that the fire was not the only thing he had been running from. For 3 days, Caleb drifted in and out of a fevered sleep. Lynn tended to him constantly, changing his bandages, forcing sips of broth and water between his lips. She ran the ranch alone, feeding the horses, checking the fire damage, her body aching with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it had settled in her bones. The fire had come dangerously close, but the rain had saved them. The barn was untouched, the house safe. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. She came into his room to find him awake, his eyes clear for the first time. He watched her as she set a bowl of soup on the small table beside his bed. "You saved my life," he said, his voice raspy. "I only did what was needed," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "No," he insisted. "You stayed. You were not afraid." She looked at him then. "I was terrified," she admitted. But leaving was not an option. A silence settled between them, different from the ones that had come before. This one was not born of awkwardness or shyness, but of shared crisis and a new, fragile understanding. Later that day, while changing the dressing on his shoulder, her fingers brushed against a thin leather cord around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt. She had noticed it before but thought nothing of it. Now, she saw a small object tied to it. It was a bird, carved from a light-colored wood, its wings outstretched in flight. The carving was delicate, detailed, and utterly at odds with the rough, practical man who wore it. He saw her looking at it. He didn't pull away. "It was my wife's," he said quietly. The words landed in the small room with the weight of stones. Lynn had assumed he was unmarried, that he had always been alone. She had never considered he might be a widower, too. Her name was Clara, he continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cabin wall. She was a carver. She could make anything out of a piece of wood. Birds, mostly. She said they were the only things that were truly free. He told her the story in pieces, the words halting, as if he were pulling them from a place long locked away. He wasn't from Nevada. He was from a wealthy family in Ohio. His father owned mills and factories. Caleb was a younger son, one who preferred horses to ledgers. He met Clara, the daughter of one of his father's managers, and fell in love with her spirit and her talent. His family disapproved of the match, considering her far beneath him. They married anyway, defiant and happy. She was not strong, Caleb said, his voice thick with old grief. Her lungs were weak. The doctors in the city said the factory smoke was killing her. They told us to go west, to find clean, dry air. So they did. They used Clara's small inheritance to buy this piece of land, this hidden valley. For 2 years, they were happy. Her health improved. They built the house and the barn with their own hands. But then came a hard winter. Clara caught a fever, and it settled in her chest. Caleb rode for 2 days straight to the nearest town with a doctor, but by the time he returned, it was too late. She was gone. Her family, he said, the words now bitter. They never forgave me. They said I dragged her out to this wilderness to die. Her brother, Julian, he swore he'd see me ruined. He said this land was bought with her money, and by rights, it should be his. Caleb had been running ever since. Not from the law, but from the ghost of his wife's family. He'd sold off most of his stock, kept to himself, hoping they would eventually forget about him, leave him to his grief in the place he and Clara had built together. His silence, his isolation, it wasn't just shyness. It was a shield. He finally looked at Lynn, his blue eyes full of a pain that mirrored her own. I brought you into this, he said. It wasn't fair. I never should have. You gave me a home when I had none, Lynn said softly, her hand hovering over his uninjured one before she rested it there. You saved Bao. We are even. But they were not. A week later, as Caleb was just beginning to move around, his arm in a sling, a rider appeared in the valley. He was not a miner or a cowboy. He was dressed in a fine city suit, his horse a sleek thoroughbred that looked out of place against the rugged landscape. He dismounted with an air of arrogant ownership and walked to the porch where Lynn was shelling beans. I am looking for Caleb Hayes, the man said. His voice was smooth, educated, and cold as river stone. He is unwell, Lynn replied, rising to her feet, placing herself between the stranger and the door. Bao, sensing her unease, came to her side, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The man's eyes flickered to the dog with disdain, then back to her. My name is Julian Vance. I am his brother-in-law. I have legal business with him regarding this property. Caleb appeared in the doorway behind her, his face pale but resolute. Julian. You shouldn't have come here. And you should never have left Ohio, Caleb, Julian retorted, his polite tone failing to mask the venom beneath. He produced a sheaf of papers from his coat. This is a court order from the territorial judge. It recognizes my family's claim to this land. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. He smiled, a thin, cruel expression. I see you found yourself some new company. I'm sure she and her mutt can find a home back in the railroad camp where they belong. The insult was deliberate, meant to wound and to isolate. Caleb took a step forward, his good hand clenched into a fist, but Lynn put a hand on his arm. Let me see the papers, she said to Julian, her voice perfectly calm. Julian looked amused but handed them to her. She scanned the documents, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her English was good, but her understanding of legal language was better. Wei had been a foreman, and she had often helped him read over the complex work contracts from the railroad company, translating the dense clauses. She read them once, then a second time. Something felt wrong. The judge's signature, the seal, it all looked official. But there was a date, and a reference to a specific territorial statute. This is a claim against the original homesteader, she said, looking up at Julian. But the deed is in your sister's name. As her husband, upon her death, the property becomes his, unless she had a will stating otherwise. Julian's smile tightened. A detail. The judge agreed the spirit of the claim was valid. The law does not care for spirits, Lynn said. It cares for details. She pointed to a line at the bottom. And this statute it quotes. It was repealed by the territorial legislature 6 months ago. The new law strengthens a husband's inheritance rights. This order is based on a law that no longer exists. Julian's face went from smug to thunderous. He snatched the papers from her hand. You're lying. Send a telegraph to the clerk's office in Carson City, Lynn said, her gaze unwavering. Ask them about Territorial Homestead Act Amendment 11B. They will tell you. Julian stared at her, then at Caleb, who was looking at Lynn with an expression of pure astonishment. The slick, confident man was cornered, his bluff called not by the rancher he despised, but by the quiet woman he had dismissed. He crumpled the papers in his fist. "This isn't over," he snarled, turning on his heel. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent fury in his wake. Caleb turned to Lynn, his expression a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. "How did you know?" "My husband taught me to read contracts," she said simply. "He always said the powerful hide their tricks in the small words." He reached out with his good hand and gently touched her cheek. "You are not afraid of anything, are you?" "I am afraid of losing my home," she said, her voice barely a whisper. And she realized, in that moment, that she was no longer thinking of the small shack in town. She was thinking of this dusty cabin, this quiet valley, and the silent man standing before her. 6 months passed. Winter came to the valley, blanketing the hills in a soft, silent layer of snow. The world shrank to the dimensions of the cabin, the barn, and the path between them. The forced proximity, which could have been a prison, instead became a kind of crucible. They learned the rhythms of each other's silence, the meaning in a shared glance across the dinner table. Caleb's arm healed, though his shoulder would always give him a twinge in the cold. He started carving again, small, clumsy attempts at first, but soon he was filling the mantelpiece with a flock of wooden birds, each one a little more detailed than the last. He was finding his way back not just to his past, but through it. Lynn planted a small winter garden in a cold frame she built against the side of the house, a technique her mother had taught her. Sprouts of green cabbage and hardy herbs pushed their way through the soil, a stubborn promise of life in the frozen landscape. They sent the telegraph to Carson City, and the reply confirmed what Lynn had suspected. Julian Vance's claim was baseless. He never returned. As the snows melted and the creek began to swell with the promise of spring, the ranch felt different. It was no longer just Caleb's place of refuge, or Lynn's place of employment. It was theirs. They had defended it together. The new fence they built along the northern pasture was straighter and stronger than the old one. The roof on the barn, which they had patched together, no longer leaked. These small, shared labors were a language all their own. One evening, Caleb came in from the barn, holding something in his hand. He walked over to where Lynn was mending one of his shirts by the fire. He opened his palm. Lying there was a newly carved bird, the most intricate he had ever made. But it wasn't a hawk or an eagle. It was a small, patient shorebird, the kind that stands steady against the tide. "This is for you," he said. She took it, the wood smooth and warm in her hand. "It's beautiful." "Lynn," he started, his voice low and serious. "What I offered you was a job. A wage. But that's not what this is anymore." "Not for me," he paused, searching for the right words he had never been good at finding. "A home isn't just a roof. It's the person you share it with." She looked up at him, her heart doing a slow, heavy turn in her chest. She saw no trace of the shy, solitary man from the constable's office. In his place was a man who was quiet, yes, but not silent. A man whose strength was not just in his hands, but in his steady, gentle heart. She thought of the notice on the post, of the $5 she couldn't pay. It had felt like the end of her world. But all it had been was the closing of a door, forcing her to walk through another. A home was not a place you found, she realized. It was a thing you built, plank by plank, meal by meal, crisis by crisis, with someone who was willing to build it with you. She closed her hand around the small wooden bird. "I know," she said, her voice full of a feeling for which she had no words. "It's my home, too." Beside the hearth, Bao lifted his head, gave a deep, contented sigh, and went back to sleep, dreaming his dog dreams in the warm, quiet safety of the house they had all made together. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.